Hey, fifth graders. All right, so this is going to be lesson 4, the Cold War. But first, obviously, we got lesson 3's answer key to go through. So, number 1, what event made the United States decide to join the Allies in World War II? That was B, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The day that will live in infamy, as they said. Number 2, what is important about D-Day? It was the very bottom one, D. It marked the beginning of the end for Germany in World War II. Number 3, Hitler's effort to destroy the Jews is called the A, Holocaust. Number 4, which Allied power and which Axis power suffered the most deaths during World War II? So if you look at that, the Soviet Union, of course, way more deaths than any other country in World War II. If you watch that video that I recommended in the previous one, then you would know that the Soviet Union's deaths were just astronomical. And then if you look, China is the next group, but China was not on either side. China was just suffering under the rule of Japan. Japan invaded and conquered China, or at least a large chunk of it. So they don't count. Germany is the Axis power who suffered the most deaths. So anyway, so that's number 4. And then number 5, what happened to many Japanese Americans during World War II? They were placed in internment camps. It's just that's the straight answer. I give you a lot of space to write, but really it was just that they were rounded up and they were forced into internment camps for a number of years. So anyway, that is that. And then the vocabulary. Number 1, I told you in the video, is internment, means to be confined in one place. Number 2, to be neutral, is to refuse to pick a side in an argument or war. Again, the United States was not neutral in World War II. We clearly favored one side over the other. We had picked a side. We just weren't willing to send soldiers to fight on that side until we kind of got dragged into the war. Number 3, people must obey a dictator because he or she is an absolute ruler, usually he. Number 4, to ration means to limit the amount of something. And number 5, people were forced to work and mistreated in the concentration camp, is the answer there for number 5. Concentration camps, of course, are what we refer to when we're talking about what the Germans did to the Jewish people. Not to be confused with internment camps, which is, I'm not saying super better, but slightly better than concentration camps. So, all right, that's the end of that. Now we have lesson 4, which is the Cold War. And here's it says Cold War, but then it's got something that's very warm that is happening, which is a nuclear bomb is being tested in the 1950s in Nevada. This is going to be a very interesting section because we go through quite a bit. But anyway, at the end of 1945, the United States was the most powerful nation in the world. But tensions grew between the United States and Soviet Union, two nations that had been allies during World War II. We are helped in this becoming the most powerful nation by the fact that Europe is in shambles, and the Soviet Union, while very powerful, is also picking up the pieces after a major war. And the United States, even though we had a lot of people die in the war, not as many as some other countries, but still a lot. However, nobody attacked the mainland of the United States. In fact, to this day, in modern wars, we've never been attacked on our own mainland. So one of the things that kind of helps us stay nice and able to help out whichever European side we choose in their wars. So far, no attacks on the United States proper, and with any luck, that'll always be the case. And hopefully we just stop having wars because they're kind of ridiculous. Anyway, many Americans disliked Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. Millions of his own people died as a result of his cruelty. As I said, basically as many, if not more, people than what Hitler killed. The Soviet Union took control of much of Eastern Europe in the years following World War II. It forced these countries to follow its economic system called communism. Communism is one of your vocabulary words. In this system, the government owns all property and resources. Americans believed that if communism spread, it would destroy the United States. This distrust led to the Cold War. This struggle was called cold because the United States and Soviet Union never attacked each other. Instead, they fought with ideas, monies, and words. Okay, the effects of World War II. In 1945, as World War II ended, many nations joined together to form the United Nations, or UN. World leaders hoped that it would solve problems peacefully and improve the lives of all people. So now we've had two world wars. At the end of the first one, we tried to have a League of Nations. The United States decided that they didn't actually want to join it for a lot of reasons that kind of tend to get glossed over, and some pretty valid ones actually. But then we have the United Nations that starts up, and that one is still going on today. A number of nations, including the United States, Great Britain, and France, also joined together in 1949 to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. The nations agreed to fight the spread of communism. The Soviet Union responded by forming an alliance of countries in Eastern Europe called the Warsaw Pact. President Harry Truman then sponsored the Marshall Plan. This provided $13 billion in food and goods to help Western Europe recover from the damage caused by the war. It also helped prevent the spread of communism. So Henry Truman actually takes over for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. During World War II, Roosevelt, he serves his 2 terms, and then he actually runs for a third, and he wins a third. And then he runs for a fourth, and he wins the fourth. However, partway through, not too long actually before the end of the war, he dies. He was elderly and sick and had a number of health issues, but he dies in office. And his running mate, Harry Truman, takes over. Truman didn't even know about the atomic bomb. They just told him, hey, by the way, we have this weapon. And he was kind of like, what? And so sort of a funny thing there happened there. But yeah, so Roosevelt is the only president to serve more than 2 terms. All the previous presidents had served, well, 2 terms if they could. Some of them only got 1, but they served 2 terms. At least partly in honor of George Washington, who said after his 2nd term, that's it, I'm done, I don't want any more. And so every other president was like, hey, if Washington only did 2 terms, then we should just do 2 terms. Interestingly, Theodore Roosevelt actually tried to run for a 3rd term. He served his 2 terms, and then there was another president who served for 1 term, and then Roosevelt came in basically and was like, hey, that guy was terrible. Let's have me be president again. And I think at least partly because he was running for that 3rd term, he did not win. And so, but it's kind of interesting that the only people who ever even really, as far as I know, ever even tried to run for more than 2 terms were both Roosevelts. It's just sort of an interesting little side thing. But I think FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he served longer in part just because we were in the middle of this world war and people were like, hey, let's not change president right in the middle of a war. That seems like a bad idea. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Shortly thereafter, though, Congress passes an amendment that basically says 2 terms are all the president gets. We are not going to have any more of this. So from here on out, it is illegal to serve more than 2 terms. So there's that. So Truman is president. Okay, part B is communism spreads. By the beginning of 1946, the Soviet Union controlled many countries in Eastern Europe. Among them was the eastern half of Germany and half of its capital, Berlin. Berlin is located entirely within Eastern Europe. The spread of communism worried British leader Winston Churchill, who said in a speech that an iron curtain has descended across Europe. Behind the Iron Curtain was a phrase used to describe countries under communist control. A new threat. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested an atomic bomb. After this event, people worried that a war between the Soviet Union and the United States might become an atomic war that could cause the end of the world. So, the Korean War. At the end of World War II, Americans and Soviet troops entered Korea to disarm the Japanese troops stationed there. The Allies divided Korea at the 38th parallel of latitude. So it's divided into a north and a south. North Korea is under control of the Soviet Union. South Korea is under control of, well, not really under control of the United States, but they're our ally, basically. American troops controlled the South while Soviet troops controlled the North. In 1950, so this is a couple of years later, War broke out on the Korean Peninsula, which was divided into two countries, North Korea and South Korea, which they still are today. As the Cold War began, talks to unify Korea broke down. South Korea became a republic, and North Korea had a communist government. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Troops from the United States and 16 other countries in the United Nations fought together to drive them back. A new war had begun. The North Koreans, helped by Chinese communist troops, so China has become a communist country at this point, Chinese communist troops used Soviet weapons, including fighter jets. Thousands of Americans and UN soldiers were killed. In addition, millions of Korean civilians were killed or driven from their homes. The Korean War ended in 1943 when a truce, one of your vocabulary words is truce, a truce was signed. A truce is an agreement to stop fighting. This truce left the border between North and South Korea where it had been in 1950. So we fought this whole war, which I don't know if the United States actually declared war. So we call it a war, but whether or not it was officially a war, I'm not sure. I don't remember off the top of my head. But basically, we fought this whole war, and in the end, everything was right where it had been at the beginning of the war. So, yay. Interesting story. So, you know, now this is maybe not super fair, but communism, one of the things is it talks about, like, you know, supporting poor people, and it's supposed to be this equal, everybody has everything in common, though really it's just the people who run the government own everything. But you know, there's this idea, the people who came up with communism had this idea that it would create this almost utopia for people who were workers and things like that. Today, North Korea is a terrible place to live. It is impoverished, it is kind of awful, and it's run by a crazy person. However, South Korea, doing pretty well, actually. So a lot of times we have found that these countries that become these communist nations, now China, of course, is a communist nation, is doing economically quite well. But some of these countries that become communist nations, it doesn't go super well for them. So it's just kind of an interesting side thing there. All right, a time of tension. During the 1950s, the United States and Soviet Union continued to develop more powerful atomic weapons called nuclear weapons. This buildup is called the arms race. Arms race is one of your vocabulary words, but it's just basically the buildup of weapons really competing against each other. The two countries were making sure that, you know, if the United States figured out how to make a certain weapon, then the Soviets wanted to make sure that they had something that was either the same or better, or at the very least could protect them against the weapon that the United States came up with. So it's just this continued escalation of capabilities basically between these two countries. Some American families, fearful of war, built bomb shelters in their homes. Fear of a nuclear attack was part of daily life. Both the United States and Soviet Union spent enormous amounts of money on weapons. So back in the 1950s, so your grandparents, maybe great-grandparents' time, kids were taught, like, hey, if there's this alarm, this means that we're having there's an atomic bomb or an atomic missile has been fired at us, and they were taught how to, like, hide underneath their desks as if that would protect them from a nuclear weapon. But you know, it was a thing. You know, they had essentially nuclear war drills, kind of like we have tornado and fire drills. So maybe not quite as frequently. And I think that a lot of people, well, some might have been scared. A lot of them, you know, it wasn't like every single day they were like, oh my gosh, I just hope that today we don't have a war. It wasn't like that, but still there were people who were very concerned about it. Okay, so Eisenhower and Kennedy. This is part C. Americans sometimes call the 1950s the Eisenhower years. Dwight D. Eisenhower served as president from 1953 to 1961. Enormous changes in American life occurred during these wars. People had money to spend, or more money to spend than ever before. Many Americans bought products such as televisions and cars. Others bought houses in growing areas outside of the cities called suburbs. So we've had this kind of influx of people into the cities, and then as people become wealthy, they realize living in the city is not fun. So then they move out of the city, but they still work in the city. So they live just on the outskirts of the city, and we call those suburbs, which a lot of people live in suburbs today. Dwight D. Eisenhower was a general during World War II. So he was, that was kind of his claim to fame. And so consequently, later on, he becomes president. We tended to do that a lot. You know, Grant was a general, he gets to be president. Washington was a general, he got to be president. Um, it's just sort of a thing that has happened frequently in the United States, particularly when you have major conflicts and these generals sort of become heroes. They a lot of times are able to transition into politics using that kind of that heroic image to get them to higher and higher offices, including the presidency. We haven't really had one. I don't know that we've had one since Eisenhower. John F. Kennedy, that we're going to talk about, he served in the military, but he wasn't a general or anything like that. I can't think of any others who were. So anyway, maybe a thing that we're moving away from. McCarthyism uses fear. So some lawmakers used the fear of communism to gain power. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy accused many Americans of being communists. Some people who were accused lost their jobs. The senator's unfair attacks became known as McCarthyism. In 1954, Congress publicly reprimanded McCarthy for his actions. So this was almost like a witch trial kind of a thing, you know, like you could be accused of being a communist and dragged before a court to prove that you weren't a communist, that sort of thing. There was a lot of people, particularly in Hollywood, who were accused and they were blacklisted. They lost their jobs and weren't able to get jobs in Hollywood because of it. There's some truth to what he was saying. Like, not everybody that was accused, you know, it's not like the witch trials where, you know, you accuse that person, you're a witch, and like, no, I'm not. And they weren't a witch because witches aren't real, at least not like the way that people were thinking of them. There's not, you know, I guess mostly women, though also men, who have sold their souls to the devil in order to gain magic powers that they use to mistreat their neighbors. That's not a real thing. At least I hope not. But there were some people who were accused of being communists who were communists because, you know, there's people today who are communists. And you know, that's probably the issue here is, you know, costing people their jobs just because they are, you know, happen to believe in a particular type of government over, you know, maybe the current type of government's not a good thing to do, but it doesn't mean that they weren't communists. So I'm not saying that he was right, because I'm not saying that at all. But at the same time, some of the people he was accusing were in fact communists. Also, the news media really, like there have been several times over the years where reporters and whatnot have gone to the Soviet Union back when that was still a thing and reported on just like how amazing the Soviet Union was, and almost kind of used it as like they're so much better than the United States. So it's a thing that has happened, that there were people who did support communism, the people who still do support communism, living in the United States, and you know, that's totally their right. They can believe whatever they want to believe. But back when we were really afraid that that was going to, you know, like people were going to rise up and destroy the United States and turn it into this communist country, that's, you know, they were afraid of people who had those beliefs, and some people really did have those beliefs. That doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to destroy the country. It just means that they believed that. So anyway, it's the book kind of paints this as like, oh, he was just a bad guy doing a bad thing. This is basically the witch trials all over again. And there were some definite similarities, except for the fact that communist sympathizers exist and witches don't. So, you know, it's easy to paint with very broad strokes and be like, this guy is bad, this guy is good, but it's not always as cut and dry as that. So anyway, the Berlin Wall. Between 1949 and 1962, about 2.5 million East Germans escaped to West Germany through West Berlin. For example, one day, the entire math department of a university left the country. East Germany needed educated workers for its economy. The reason why they were fleeing is because Soviet-controlled Germany and East Berlin was an awful place to live, and it was not safe, just a really, really bad situation for the German people, whereas West Germany was enjoying all these freedoms, and that made it very appealing to escape to West Germany, and to West Berlin, and then to Western Germany. Let's see. In 1961, the leader of the Soviet Union, and I'm going to butcher his name, I think it's Nikita, let's see, Khrushchev. Anyway, he ordered a wall built to separate communist East Germany from West Berlin and East Berlin. This wall prevented East Germans from escaping. The Berlin Wall became a symbol of division between communism and democracy. I still remember to this day when the Berlin Wall was finally broken down. It was a big, big thing. It was awesome to watch on TV. And it was, it was pretty amazing. Also, you had families. I mean, there was literally families who were separated from each other for all the while that this wall was up. And trying to flee from Eastern Germany and get across the wall. Like there was people who did their best to escape, but it was if you got caught, you were killed. It was that simple. So, and the fact that people still tried it kind of shows you just how bad it was in East Berlin and in East Germany. Let's see. So the space race. Oh man. So this thing is like that big on your page. The space race is an entire unit in and of itself. It was awesome. I really encourage you guys to go in and check this stuff out. But anyway, in 1957, the Soviets launched a satellite called Sputnik. Satellite is one of your vocabulary words. Into orbit around Earth. A satellite is an object that circles another object. The United States then created its own space program. The two countries raced to get farther into space. We're just going to skip all the interesting stuff. On July 20th, 1969, American Neil Armstrong became the first human being to walk on the moon. Armstrong said, quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." So here is a picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon as part of the Apollo space program. Since the Apollo space program ended, we have not gone back to the moon. In fact, just, aside from going up to the space station, which the United States doesn't even send ships up to the space station anymore, we've basically got other countries who are in charge of that. Our space program is not quite shut down, but it is certainly far more limited than it should be or was. A lot of that has to do with budget cuts and things like that. So this cuts out a ton of things that happened here. For one thing, when the Soviet Union put Sputnik up, Sputnik was basically just this little ball that went around the Earth, and it did give out like a beeping sound. You could pick it up on your radio, the little beeping noise that it made, and you could see it. That was kind of the big thing. Is Americans would go outside and look up at, up at the stars, and you could see this little thing travel across the sky, and they knew that was put up there by the Soviet Union. And because of the fear that was so prevalent, people weren't sure what all it could do. Like, was it, somehow spying on us? Was it picking up information about us? They didn't know. They had no idea what this thing was, aside from a thing that the Soviet Union had been able to put into space, and it stayed there for a very, very, very long time. So the Americans freak out, and they start doing their own stuff. There's a whole lot of drama that goes into this. We've talked a little bit about some of it, in particular as it relates to Black history, but also, the Americans are trying to get astronauts into space, and the Soviet Union's actually the first man to make it into space is from the Soviet Union. Eventually the United States, once we realize, hey, we're in this race, and Americans really get behind this space race, the United States is able to catch up and surpass the Soviet Union, and then we are the first people, and I think the only people to have actually walked on the moon. I want to say it's 13 Americans have walked on the moon and nobody else, which is in and of itself pretty awesome. It's a little bit of a pity that it has not happened since like the 1970s. It'd be nice if we were actually doing a little bit more, but traveling through space is extremely dangerous and very costly, and so that's why it's not something that we are sending humans up to do. We tend to send like Mars rovers and things like that. We've done that, but we don't send a lot of people into space anymore, aside from the astronauts who go to the space station, but that's actually considered to be low Earth orbit, essentially. So, but deep space, so getting to the moon, getting beyond the moon, we don't send people out there. There's a whole lot of issues that go into it, and we just haven't figured out how to get around them, and certainly haven't figured out how to get around them in a cost-effective manner. Okay, so the next section is the Cuban Missile Crisis. For many people, the most frightening event of the Cold War era is one of your vocabulary words, just ERA, which is a period of history, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a successful revolution in Cuba, an island nation that is just 90 miles from Florida. After the revolution, Cuba became the first communist nation in the Americas. There are islands in Key West, which is these little islands that come off of the tip of Florida, that are closer to Cuba than they are to the mainland United States. So Cuba is pretty close to us, and we start kind of freaking out a little bit about this whole thing. In 1962, Khrushchev, again, that's the Soviet Union leader, placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba to keep Soviet ships from bringing more missiles to Cuba. Many Americans feared an attack would be launched from Cuba. So Cuba is very close to the United States. If these missiles were launched from there, we would have almost no time to react. You know, at this time in history, if a missile is shot at you, there's nothing you can do anyway. We didn't have a way of like stopping it or that sort of thing, but there would be no warning. So people were very concerned that, you know, from Cuba, a nuclear missile could be launched in the United States. It could hit Washington, D.C. It could hit all of the Midwest, that sort of thing, pretty easily. There's some very major U.S. cities that would be within striking distance of even just a, you know, kind of okay missile that the Soviet Union is putting in Cuba, which is very scary. And the United States had every right to be very unhappy about the whole situation. After tense talks, Khrushchev ordered Soviet ships to turn back. Soviet missiles in Cuba were taken apart. In return, the United States promised not to attack. Okay, so this very much downplays a situation. There's like literally the United States had ships lined up facing Soviet ships that are coming towards them. And it was a case of, if those ships don't turn around, we're going to attack them and we're going to sink them, which would be basically bringing the United States and the Soviet Union into war with each other. Don't know this for a fact, but I'd be very shocked if the United States did not already have a way of attacking the Cuban missile sites. So there was some sort of order that was like, hey, if our Navy gets into a fight with the Soviet Navy, the first thing we do is we're taking out all of these missile silos and making it so they can't attack us. So there's these very tense talks, and eventually the Soviets did stop and turn around. This was kind of an event that really cemented John F. Kennedy as a great president, that he stared down the Soviet Union as they were attempting to bring these missiles in to Cuba that would have been able to attack us. Okay, so that is the end of this unit. It's kind of funny. We're going to end with this, and then, okay. It does come up here a little bit. Sorry, I'm looking at the next unit here, and okay, so it does talk about what happens to John F. Kennedy, which you guys probably already know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this unit or this lesson, and good luck on the check understanding and the vocabulary. All that. Have a good day. Talk to you later.